Hi everyone, it's Amy here and this is video number 7 in our Back to School Ready series. Today we're going to be talking about everything to do with diagnostic assessment. So those key pieces of assessment that you do at the beginning of the year. Now there are a couple of different reasons why you would be doing assessment at the beginning of the year. The first one is whole school data. So your school might be dictating that you have to do a certain assessment piece so that they can track students' progress, or it's just something that your school is doing, it links to a program. There is a reason why your school is making you do it, and obviously we can't budge those, we must do those ones. Then there are assessments that inform you as the teacher where a certain student is sitting, and obviously those ones are going to be the ones that inform your practice the most. And then there are ones that belong with a program. So you're setting something up in your classroom and you have to do the assessment first to find out where your students are situated within that program. For example, words their way or sound waves. And then the other type of assessing you might be doing is to monitor student growth over the whole year. So maybe you're getting their reading age or their spelling age at the beginning of the year and you're going to retest them at the end to see how well they have grown. The next thing is, when do you do these assessments? So the school dictated ones, obviously they're going to tell you exactly when to do them, but for the rest of them, that's your own decision when you do them. And I recommend not doing them in the first couple of days of school for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it would be so cruel for a new kid to be coming into your class and you shove an assessment in their face like, hey, take this. Like, it's not the best way to start your relationship. It's not a great thing for the kids to experience as soon as they've come back. The second reason is because you're not going to get very accurate results. At the end of last year, the students were here. Then they experienced the summer slide, which is where they're not practicing reading as much, they're not writing as much, so they take this slide. And then when they come back for the first few days of school, that's when they're at their worst. And then as they kind of get back into routine, they sort of catch up to about here. They never really get back up to the same point that they finished the year at, but you know, they get higher as the first few days of school progress. So you don't really want to be doing any assessing in the first 2 days, 3 days of school if you can help it, although I will talk about a couple of exceptions to that rule. So now I'm going to take you through all of the assessments that I do at the beginning of the year and tell you the reasons why I do them so that you can make your decisions as to what diagnostic assessments you want to do in your classroom. And I am going to be recommending some certain particular assessments that you might want to get your hands on. So the first one is a generic writing sample. Within like maybe the 3rd or 4th day of school, within the first week, you want them to give a writing sample. For years 1 to 3, I usually go for a narrative or a recount because that's usually what they feel quite confident in. And then for upper grades, sometimes year 3, mostly year 4, 5 and 6, I would do a persuasive writing text because that's when you're really going to see their skills come out. You could do a narrative there as well though. There are a couple of reasons why you want to start with a writing example. The first one is so that you can look at some whole class data. So what I like to do is get a checklist that has very basic things on it, like capital letters, full stops, and then for the older kids you get into a couple more complex things like paragraphs and figurative language and simple or compound sentences. And you just sit there and you just check against that what the student was using in their work sample. Then you can kind of look at that and you can gauge where your class is sitting as a whole. So for example, if I'm in a year 3 class and I see that 75% of my students are all using full stops, I'm probably not going to do a whole class lesson on full stops because that wouldn't be the most useful use of my time. What I would do is those students who aren't showing me full stops, I would take them and do little mini workshops with them. I'd do one-on-one time with them and I would set it as their goal, which I'll get back to in just a second. So you'd be looking through to find out things that the whole class kind of needs to move on with. So in a grade 3 class, you might discover that only 45% are even using paragraphs. So that would definitely be one of my first whole class lessons that I would be doing, would be targeting paragraphs because that's the next thing they need in their writing progression. As I mentioned a second ago, I do writing goals. I have a very large poster in my room and this is something you can get for free from me if you would like. And I just have students' names on little laminated tags and each week they just move around to whatever goal they need to work on. So for those students who weren't using full stops, that would probably be their first goal. I'd put their little name tag on full stops And when we go to do our weekly writing, which for younger kids I always do a recount at the start of the week. For older kids, it's some sort of writing lesson like creative writing that we do, where I say, okay, this is your goal, this is what you need to work on, this is how you can work on it, this is how you can show me that you can use it, different things like that. They're aware of their goal, they keep a track of it, and when they hand in their work, I can tick off whether they have achieved that goal or not. If they do achieve it, I move their name down to another goal. And sometimes they might go back to that goal that they've already checked off, because obviously not everything is retained long term. Some things we need continual practice at. The second reason I love to do a writing sample is to show progression. So I put it in their assessment folder, and I'll show you the assessment folder a little bit better in a while, but basically I put their very first writing sample in there, and then next to it I put their most recent one at the end of the year. And you can do that throughout the year. I often put a couple of samples in so they can just compare. And with younger kids, this is amazing to see that maybe they started the year with like one sentence, and then by the end of the year, they're writing like a whole page. It can just be a really amazing thing for them to actually visually see their growth. So that's the writing sample. The next one that I do is some sort of spelling assessment. Now, my school has been muddling around with different spelling programs for a few years now, and they definitely haven't found one that they love yet. But what I will do this year is a sound waves assessment, because that is what we're using at our school. But I have really loved the Words Their Way assessment. I don't love the Words Their Way program, but their assessment is amazing because it is looking for sounds that the students will get wrong, and then you can teach them those sounds to help them move their spelling ability along. So you might want to look at some sort of phonics assessment like that, where it's testing the sounds within spelling of words. The other spelling assessment I do is for my own program. My spelling program is more on the grounds of memorization. While I do think it's very, very important to teach phonics and sounds and all that, I think there is a place for memorizing spelling words. That's what was missing from my spelling programs when I was in primary school, and I think it's the main reason that I didn't learn to spell very well, because sounds were just not clicking for me. It wasn't, in all honesty, it wasn't until I went through university and had to start learning how to teach sounds that they started clicking for me, and I was like, oh, there's that rule, and that rule connects this rule, and that's why this happens. It didn't make sense to me in primary school, so I really think there is a place for both. And in terms of memorization, like my daughter, I started with her trying to memorize sight words and found out that she was actually more about the rules and the phonics. So you just never know with students. They can be completely different learners to each other, and I think the more we try and cover all of the different types of learning styles, the more inclusive our classrooms are going to be, and the more effective we're going to be with our teaching. So I've digressed a little bit here. Let's get back on track. For my spelling program, I run them through a list of words. My spelling program is all about lists. It has 10 words on each list. So what I do is I take the hardest word from every single list, or in my opinion and my experience what the hardest word is, and I test the students on those. The first word that they get wrong, that is their list they are going to start on in my spelling program. So that assessment is quite quick in the younger years, because they're only going to do like 5 to 10 words. In the older years, that can take up a little bit more time, because some of those kids need to be tested on 100 words. But what I do is I let the students off in dribs and drabs. So as soon as they've got their word wrong, I say, okay, you can pack up your book now and put it away and just have a little bit of reading time at their desk. I don't put them through the whole spelling list, because that would not be nice. I also do the South Australian Spelling Test, which is a standardised test that is going to give your students a spelling age. I mainly do this because it is a whole school assessment that we do, but it also validates that my students are making good progress within my spelling program from the start of the year till the end when we repeat the assessment. The next type of assessment you're probably going to want to have is a reading assessment. Now, I am all about running records. I love running records. If you're not familiar with them, basically students read a passage of text by themselves, then they come to you and they read that passage of text out loud, and you sit there ticking a copy of that passage, ticking the words off that they got right, showing when they've got words wrong, showing when they've attempted it or sounded it out. You record things like their fluency and their speed and their accuracy, self-correction rate, all of those sorts of things. And then you ask them questions based on the text at different comprehension levels. You record their answers to those and tick off whether they got them right or not. Running records are usually leveled, so you get a reading age as well. At my school, for the younger years, we use the PM benchmarks, which are pretty good. But what I like even more than that, what we use in our school in the upper grades, is probe reading. Now, probe reading doesn't seem to go as low as PM benchmarks do, and that's why I think we use both at our school, and that's why if I'm in the lower grades, I still use PM benchmarks. But why I like probe more is because they keep the page to one page. They have the passage and the questions all on one page, whereas PM benchmarks is an A3 piece of paper back and front. So it's just a lot of paper to be wielding around. I wish it was a little bit more condensed. In favour for the PM benchmarks is they actually have books that go along with them, whereas the probe is just a text. The PM benchmark has pictures, so in the younger years you can test whether they are using picture clues in their reading, although there's debate over whether students should use that or not. I'm for it. I think defaulting to the pictures to help you read is fine, but I don't want to get in an argument here, so if you disagree, just let it go, we can move on with it. So I love doing running records because it's going to tell me what their reading age is. It's going to show me what techniques they're using while reading, and it's going to show me what comprehension level they're at and where I can work on and specific targets for their reading ability. However, the running records take a long time. You have to dedicate at least 10 minutes per student to get through a running record. So it's not really practical to say I'm going to get through all of them in the first week of school. What I choose to do is from about the second week of school, I will start doing them during my silent reading time. So straight after lunch, the kids come in, they all silently read, and I will pick 2 students to do a running record for, and I usually try and target the weaker students, and I'll talk in a second about how I know which ones are the weaker, and I try to work my way up to the students that have the higher ability level. One, because the lower ability students are going to have shorter texts, so you're going to get through them quicker, and 2, you're probably going to have the most impact immediately on that lower group if you start targeting their stuff, whereas the higher group, you'll make progress with them when you know what they need to work on, but they could do with revising a lot of other stuff first, so it doesn't matter if you're going over things that they already know. So I pick up like 1 or 2 students doing silent reading, and I run through their running record with them. Going back to what I said a second ago about knowing whether students are weak or not, because I choose to do literacy groups in my classroom where I do have a guided reading group who sits with me and I have a text that is at their level, I do need to know pretty well how my students are reading at the start of the year. And I have been toying with a lot of different diagnostic assessments for reading, and I can't say I have come up with my favourite yet. I do really like the Waddington reading test in the lower grades, but it only goes up to, I think it's 11 years old, so I feel like by year 4 most of the kids are topping out of it. You're not really finding out much about them. Like, you can get a reading age from it, but it's not telling you where they really need to work on. There's no comprehension. There's a little bit of comprehension, but it's not going to tell you whether it's literal or inferential types of questions that they're having issues with, or evaluation or all that jazz. But with the lower kids, when you're looking at do they need to know initial sounds or middle sounds or end sounds or sentences, that's a really good assessment for them to use. So if you are in the lower grades, you might like to look up the Waddington reading test. I had some upper teachers recommend the Daniel and Diak's test, so I did that for the last 2 years, but I find that a lot of the students can't get high scores on it because it's a very old test, and so unless you're really familiar with how they used to speak in the olden days and some of the vocabulary that was around back then that's not now, it's really hard for them to get a good score on it. And again, it's not really going to show you a wide range of stuff. So as part of my reading rotations, one of my groups does a reading box, which is where you have all those comprehension cards, all at different levels. The students work through about 10 cards before they progress to the next level, and that actually comes with an assessment to put the kids on the different levels. And I'm thinking, because I do that to level the students in the reading comprehension box, maybe I can try and use it for leveling them in my reading groups. I still don't think it's the best option in the world, but it's what I'm running with this year if I don't find another assessment that I like in the meantime. But what it is going to do is level out your class. So you can say, oh, all of these students are around this level, they're going to be in a reading group together. All of the students around this level, they're going to be in a reading group together. And these are my students who did really well on it, so they're going to be in this reading group. So by doing that within the first week, usually on the 3rd or 4th day of school, I can see exactly where my reading groups are going to be, and I can start literacy rotations almost straight away. By the 2nd week, we're off and running, we're doing literacy rotations, and I can move those kids around as needed during the year if I find that maybe I didn't have them quite right, maybe somebody didn't test very well in the first week, but actually they're quite bright and they need to move up, or maybe for a week I want everybody who is having trouble with literal questions, I want all of them in one group, so I might move them for that. The last of the English assessing that I do is for sight words, and I do this in grades roughly 1 to 3, with the upper grades being on an as-need basis. So sight words are going to be really dependent on your school and what your school's using, whether they're using Fry Words or Magic 100 or Oxford. You know, there's so many lists around, so check with your school first if they have a particular list. But what I like to do with mine is I break them up into groups of 10, and I have my students just do 10 words at a time, and then I give them a break and I bring them back up and we'll do 10 words again later on. If you've got like year 3s, they're probably going to like go through these quite quickly. They can probably read quite quickly, so you probably go through about maybe 10 lists at a time, but you want to give them a break in between just so they can get back again. I have a rule that they need to answer within 4 seconds. If they don't answer within 4 seconds, it's not really a sight word. They're using some sort of decoding strategy, and you really want them to become fluent with it. So I do the 4-second time limit, and I usually try and start this within the first 2 weeks of school if I can. Because I'm breaking them up into such small groups when I ask them to test for the words, I just try and do it in pockets of time. So once I've got to know my students after the first week, I don't need to be like at the door greeting them all the time. So I might sit at my desk after a little bit and just nut out a couple of these. Sometimes I'll do a few of these while I'm waiting for one of my students to finish reading their running record passage. So when you give a running record passage, they have to read it to themselves first before you can test them. So sometimes I'll be doing these while they're doing that. Sometimes I will just have a task during the first week of school that is just easy for them to do. I explain it to them and then I say, okay, you guys are going to go do that, and I'm going to be doing some assessing over here. Don't be afraid to use activities like that when you have to. Especially in the afternoon when the kids are starting to get tired, set them up with something and go and get your testing done. And then by the second week, I have everything I want set up so the sight words can start actually being practiced. I use mastery folders. If you don't know what mastery folders are, let me know in the comments below and I'll try and do a video or a blog post or something on them to let you know all about them. So let's now go to maths. As I said at the start of the video, you want to have a clear reason why you're giving the assessment. So if the assessment is meant to show you where the students are at, make sure they're showing you where the students are at. When I was first doing my teaching, I tried out MTS testing, I did PAT-M, I've done a couple of other random maths tests I don't even remember the name of that have come up from places. But what I found about those maths tests was often they would show me which questions the kids got right or wrong, but it wasn't actually showing me what the students could do. Okay, so they couldn't add that 3-digit and 3-digit number together, but can they add a 2-digit number? Like, you just want an assessment that's thorough and actually going to show you that if a student didn't achieve this question, well, here is where they're at. And because I couldn't find an assessment that I liked anywhere, I ended up creating my own. You may have seen these on my page before. These are my mathematics tests. I have them for years foundation to year 6, and I have them for each of the 3 strands. So I actually separated out the strands, and in all honesty, what I usually do is the number and algebra initial test at the beginning of the year, but I don't usually do statistics and probability and measurement at the beginning of the year. Or sometimes I might just take a page out of it or a question out of it just to get an idea of where the students are at. But I think the number and algebra strand kind of has more importance over the rest, and it is more detailed and there's a lot more to the stages that the students go through. Whereas measurement and geometry and statistics and probability, they sort of overlap a lot more in the curriculum level and you're building a lot more slowly. Again, my own opinion, please don't hate me for it. So what I did with these maths tests is I took the Australian curriculum outcomes and I made sure that for each outcome I had questions that showed a range so that I would know within this outcome what the students could and couldn't do, and if they were working at a lower level, what were they actually able to do. So there are multiple questions for each outcome at multiple different levels. Now you can see here, this is the year 4 test, and this one's not back and front, but it is a little bit chunky. So with the younger kids, you may want to break up doing this assessment over a couple of days. So with my year 1s, I would give them this test and we would just sit for half an hour and students would get however much done they could in half an hour. With older students, we would spend an hour, and again, however much they can get done in an hour, and then we'd have a break and the next day we would come back. And I wasn't like on at them as to you can't go back and redo a question from the day before. I don't think most kids are going to remember the questions in a math test and go home and ask the answers or talk about it out in the playground. So I kind of just went, you know, they're not going to do that. So they could just flip back and forth and do any questions they wanted. And then when they hand that in, it's fairly quick and easy to mark because most of the questions are either right or wrong. So what I do, you can see here on this sample page, is I just go through and I tick if they got it right, and then I put the score that they got, and then you can bring that score back over here and write it in here to show how they're achieving each outcome. And there is a recommended C grade here, so if they like the student here got 9, the C grade was 9, so this student's doing well in that area. For the beginning of the year, I actually test the Australian curriculum levels from the year before. So this is a year 4 test. Sorry, well, this is the final. Pretend for a second this says year 4 initial. That means that it would be testing the year 3 outcomes, not the year 4 outcomes. I do know some teachers who prefer to give them to their students so they're seeing where they come in at their own year levels curriculum, and at the end of the year they give it to them again to see how much they progressed. But I think you've got to be careful with that because the outcomes can be so different between the year levels that they might not be able to do anything in there, and that might take away from their confidence a little bit. But if you did some explaining at the beginning, you said, you know, this is a year 5 test, this is what you need to know at the end of the year, you might be able to set them up for success in that if they can do any of it, they're going to be really impressed with themselves. From this, I take all the information and I put it into an Excel spreadsheet, which highlights itself according to whether the students just achieved the outcome, are way above the outcome, or are below, and then you've got your whole class data right there. So you know that you need to go back and cover that before you move on with the next year levels curriculum. So I usually do this on the 3rd or 4th day of school, sometimes not until the 2nd week, because I really want them to have confidence in the classroom before I go and put something like this in front of them. And like I said, the one I use at the beginning of the year is called the initial one, and then I do one just before I do term 2 reports, and then I do one just before I do the the semester 2 reports, because then it does all my grading for me and it helps me with my maths comments. The other thing I test in mathematics is multiplication for years 3 to 6. So it's usually a one-on-one assessment. I start with the 1 times tables, then I go to the 10s, then 2s, then 5s, 3s, 4s, 6s, 7s, 8s, 9s, 11s and 12s. And I just muddle up the order. I definitely don't do it in the correct order. I usually start with the 9 first. So let's say I'm doing the 1 times table, I'll start with 1 times 9, because if they don't know that, you know that's the one they need to work on, rather than wasting time going 1 times 1, 1 times 2, which they probably know, whereas the 1 times 9, if they're going to get it wrong, that's the one that they're going to get wrong. And then again, I do mastery folders, just like I do with sight words in the lower grades. I use mastery folders for multiplication as well. For all of the other subjects, I don't do any assessing. I don't do any diagnostic assessing for HAS, for science, for health, for STEM. Like, I just don't see the point. Usually it's not going to inform my teaching. I've got new content to teach in my year level that's not the same content as the previous year level, so it doesn't seem logical to go and waste time trying to fit in more assessments, because as I said at the start of the video, these assessments that you do or you choose to do at the start of the year, they need to have a purpose, and if they don't have a purpose, then why are you putting the students through them? Why are you taking up your time? So the last thing I want to do is I just want to show you how I keep all of their assessments. So I like to have an A4 display file. If you can, try not to get the ones like this. If you can alter your book list, go for spines like this, because then they don't break and the sheets don't all fall apart. One day I will change the book list so I don't have to have ones like this. On the first page, I always like to start off with a portfolio cover that says my school name, it says the student's name, sometimes I let them draw pictures on it, whatever floats your boat. And then I have a contents page. Don't feel like you have to in your first year, because you probably won't know a lot of the assessments that you're going to do, but when you've been teaching for as long as I have, you've probably got most of them pretty like packed down. You know which ones you're going to do, so you can add a contents page. And most recently, you might have seen the post I did a while ago, I have started adding tabs on my display files so you can actually find these sections more easily. But again, I don't recommend that in your first couple of years of teaching, so I'm not going to go into detail on that. But basically I say that goals and reflections are on the first page. This is something that I do at the end of each term. It's always a different performer each term that just talks about things that they liked and didn't like. You could do one at the start of the year. I usually don't, just because of a time factor. Then I dedicate a couple of pages to writing samples. I always start off with the one that they did on the day of the first week and build it up to the one that they did on the last day. But with my older students, I change the text types. So the first one will be narrative, then persuasive, then recount, then procedure, and then poetry. Then I have their spelling tests. So this one had 2 spelling tests. This was done, I think, 3 or 4 years ago, so it's a while ago now. My portfolios have changed a lot since then. Then I put my reading assessments. Again, I've got the first one that they did on one side and the last one of the year on the other side, which does mean that they spend a lot of the year with empty sleeves, which is why having a contents page can be really hard in your first couple of years of teaching, because then you've got to go through it with the students and try and get them to slot it into the right page. So it's probably not worth the headache at the beginning of the year in your first couple of years of teaching. These are the PM benchmarks, so extra reading tests. Sorry, I had the maths test in there. Then I've got the maths test for number and algebra. Again, this is initial, and this is the final one. Then I have statistics and probability over here, and measurement and geometry here. And this is actually an example of how I've used my maths test, where I didn't want to put them through a whole maths test at the end of the year. We'd done it at the middle of the year so I could report on measurement and geometry for the first time. I already knew where a lot of the students sat for different things. They were really good at certain areas, so I just gave them the time page because I knew that's where a lot of the students were struggling, so that informed my grades and informed my comments that I wrote. Don't feel like you need to use all of the tests that you have. Then I go on to other learning areas. So this was HAS, this was technologies, this was health, and then, you know, if you're teaching science or whatever else, you'd have other ones back there. But none of those assessments that I showed you at the end there were diagnostic assessments at the beginning of the year. They were all ones that were done at the end of units and such. That's the video for today, all about assessments for the beginning of the year. As I've said a couple of times throughout this video, it's really about you picking what's going to inform you. What are you going to be able to get information out of? There's no point doing a test if it's not going to show you any information. If you're just going to put it in a file, lock it away for a year, and then at the end of the year go, oh, look at that assessment that we did at the beginning of the year, then there's really no point putting your students through it. So be careful about the assessments you pick. Pick them for the right reasons and the right time. You don't need to assess everything at the beginning of the year. You can assess them, you know, throughout the year at different stages. So let's say you're in a year 1 class and at some point you want to do sequencing with your students. Can they sequence a story? It doesn't mean you have to have assessed it within the first 2 weeks of school. You can assess it right before you teach it. So these assessments that I took you through today are just the ones that I think are key for the beginning of the year that are really going to start your year off right. I hope you guys have enjoyed today's video, and if you have been teaching for longer than a year, I would love it if you pop down in the comments the different assessments that you use and why you choose to use those assessments. I would love to hear from you, especially if you have a reading assessment that you can recommend me that I can do at the beginning of the year that doesn't take the students much time to do and can help me level my students out. I'll catch you guys in tomorrow's video.